Hello, I am Tom Roach, host of Calumet Perspectives, and with me to my immediate right is Dr. David Detmer, author of Challenging Postmodernism, the Politics of Truth, and the philosophy and the politics of truth. And to David's immediate right is James Martinez. James is a former journalist. He was a Sun-Times associate managing editor, and he's the current owner of Right Story Group Communication Consultancy. All of us teach at Purdue Calumet, and all three of us, coincidentally, are graduates of Northwestern, which we didn't realize until today. Our topic today is journalism and sort of where did we come from, how did we get here, where are we going? But David's book talks a lot about objectivity, and I thought that might be a good place to start. David, I've got a quote here from your book here. You said that you referred to the postmodern attacks on objectivity. Can you describe that a little bit for us?
Yes, postmodernists tend to attack the idea that it's possible to arrive at objective truth, meaning the kind of truth that is true independently of what anyone might happen to think or feel or want to be the case, so that an objective truth would be the kind of thing that if you denied it, you'd simply be mistaken. And so postmodernists have tended to argue, no, that's not possible. All we can get at is different perspectives, different opinions, that sort of thing.
Okay, and if we to approach this historically, I would guess there was a time when journalists believed they were telling the objective truth. And I know when I was in journalism school in the 70s, my professor said that, of course, objectivity is unobtainable. And then 5 minutes later said we better be objective or we were going to flunk the class, essentially. What was your experience with that in journalism school, Jim?
There was a lot of duality here. I remember journalism school classes where people talked and talked and talked forever about the importance of objectivity and aspiring to it. But the fact of the matter is that more time was spent, has historically been spent, trying to glean some truth, some objective truth, than is taking place today. I mean, today we're settling for two sides of a story, even when a story doesn't have two sides. That's a problem. Okay. And so I think that we need to get back to the cornerstones of journalism, the things that delivered value to our readers and our viewers, and that was somebody actually digging into a story and figuring out what was right, what was wrong, and what really impacts people.
Okay. Well, just to come at that a little more slowly, because I know David has a lot to say about that. David, you were quoting discussion you saw on television that had Ted Koppel and Walter Cronkite there, and I just wanted to share that with everyone before we went any further.
Sure, this was a program I saw back in the early 1980s. It was on PBS, and it did feature Walter Cronkite and Ted Koppel, who at that time were two of the most famous television journalists. And they both took the view that the biggest task a journalist has to face is to be objective, and they went on to define it in terms of having no preconceptions. And Ted Koppel even said, my mind is a tabula rosa, which is a mispronunciation of the Latin, but in any case, the idea that the mind is a blank slate, and I have no preconceptions whatsoever, and Cronkite was saying the same thing. And I think that's a disastrous approach to objectivity. I think one can't get at the truth except by forming hypotheses about what is the case, trying to test them against evidence, sifting through relevant arguments, and so forth. Right. You can't do it by having an empty head and claiming that you can then observe what's happening accurately.
What's interesting, though, is that Cronkite had strong points of view on a variety of things. Science, for example. He was a huge fan of science. He was a huge fan of the entire NASA mission, and that strengthened his reporting. And so it's interesting that they dwelt so long on the idea of somehow pretending that they have no preconceptions, because those can enrich your knowledge and your approach to reporting.
But I would agree with that, but I would add it will enrich it more if one is quite self-consciously aware of those preconceptions.
Absolutely.
So you can test them. Whereas if you're pretending to yourself and to others that you don't have them, then there's greater danger that they'll be working mischief that you're not aware of.
Right.
You're absolutely right, David. You have to be honest with yourself. So.
Well, I, from a practical standpoint, when I've taught journalism, I like to quote Bob Woodward, who said that we're looking for the best available version of the truth.
Yeah, which he often doesn't get.
Well, another subject for another story. But what about that? I mean, isn't that acknowledging that there may be more to this than I know, but I'm making a professional effort to provide the most accurate account of what I perceive to be, and again, it's what I perceive, but what I perceive to be the truth regarding the matter that's being reported. How do you feel about that? The best available version of the truth.
I think that there is actual truth in life, in the world. Let's go baseball for a second.
Okay.
My perception is that I didn't strike out. The pitcher's perception is that he struck me out. The umpire has to make a decision. And so that becomes the truth about that particular at-bat.
Right.
I think that journalists delude themselves into thinking that quoting 2 or 3 sides of an issue is the same as really reporting the issue. And I would argue that it's not.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. We're having more agreement than I was expecting here.
Right.
But,
Sorry.
Well, let me say this to try to shake things up a little bit, although maybe you'll agree, I don't know. In addition to I agree completely with your point that it's no substitute for seeking the truth, simply asking for 2 or 3 opinions.
Right.
But also, I think the opinion sought, there's a real flaw in that. And one of my concerns is the coverage of foreign affairs. And here's an example. Lots of studies have been done about this, about sourcing. How, for example, let's say the U.S. government is supporting one foreign government and they're against rebels who are fighting that government. Whereas in another country, they're supporting the rebels and against the government. Now you look at who is quoted in news articles, and invariably, in the country where we're supporting the government, all the quotes are going to be from our government and from that government, very, very few from the rebels. Whereas in this other country where we're backing the rebels, the quotes will be from our government and the rebels and very few from the other government. So there's a tremendous systematic bias in the selection of the sources of who's talked to and who's interviewed across the board.
How do you account for that?
It sounds like David would like to account for it as suggesting that journalists in this country are a propaganda branch of government. And I think that's a real problem, because I think that's certainly not the case. You may have a press that isn't as sophisticated about international affairs as it could be, but your suggestion that journalists here simply quote government and accepts what they say as gospel, that's certainly not accurate, and it certainly hasn't been historically.
Well, that's not what I said. I didn't say they accept it as gospel. It was simply a point about who the sourcing is. I mean, and then there you'll have hard numbers. There are studies done here in the New York Times, Washington Post, whatever, where 97% of the quotes are either from our government official or the side we're backing, and 3% are from the other side. That's the point I'm making. But, I mean, I will say, in general, the perspective that will be adopted, if there is a consensus among mainstream U.S. political power brokers, the Democrats and Republicans, that's the perspective the press will play. They're not going to play up some independent standard.
One take on this, provided by David Entman in Democracy Without Citizens, is that...
Isn't that Robert Entman?
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes, Robert Entman.
Sorry, don't mean to be pedantic.
Yeah. No, you're very good. It's been a while. Anyway, he argues that that journalists have to interview experts. They can't just... I mean, they do interview men on the street sometimes, right? But that's not considered good reporting in most cases, right? And so if you're doing a story on foreign policy and you have to interview an expert, he tried to map this out, and he said that on any given story about foreign policy, there's only about 50 to 75 people who are going to be available for you to interview. They're all people who served under one of the presidents. They're former embassy people. They all went to Georgetown or to Harvard or someplace, and that there's a consensus among them that nobody's trying to manage necessarily, but it's just sort of the result of them all having been educated in the same ways and worked for the same government. And so reporters then, in trying to cover these stories, end up calling people who tend to agree with one another.
Yeah, I think he's wrong about that.
Okay.
I mean, it's true that sort of the officially accepted experts, they all agree. But there are plenty of other experts who aren't officially accepted.
Well,
so there'll be people,
so
there'll be independent scholars or human rights or international human rights organizations, people like that, people who've been on the field looking at these things. It's true that the people who sort of rise to the top, they're ones who have the right kind of ideas. I mean, this has been talked about extensively in lots of areas of life. I mean, people in the CIA, the Soviet experts who predicted what Gorbachev was going to do correctly, those people got squeezed out because they weren't saying what their bosses wanted to hear, the ones who had the greatest expertise. And I think we find a lot of that in journalistic sourcing. They go to the people who are sort of the accepted mainstream experts as opposed to going by some independent standard of expertise.
Well, both Jim and I have worked in public relations, and one of the things that you take advantage of in public relations is that journalists often go to the easiest source.
Right.
And so by being, prompt and having, useful information for them, you can feed information into the system. The journalist is under pressure to get a story done, and a lot of times a source can kind of predict what direction a story is going to go in. So, I mean, I'm certain that some of that goes on too, but I'm just pointing out that there's probably procedural explanations for some of this
I agree.
bias.
I think there's procedural explanations for practically all of it.
Okay.
I agree with you there.
Yeah.
There was a professor at Northwestern, a professor of sociology at Northwestern by the name of Dave Beck. And Dave became a media darling because he would become the instantaneous expert on any question that a reporter had a random interest in. And so a reporter, literally, this is what would happen. A reporter would call him up, spend 5 minutes briefing him on whatever issue he needed a quote for, and Dave would instantly produce a quote.
Yeah.
He was very accessible. He made himself, he came up with pithy quotes, and therefore he was a great source. Also, terrible for the dissemination of real truth.
Right, right. Well, so what I'd like to move on to next then is a question. Are we perhaps solving the problem to some extent by this move that we seem to be making right now towards a partisan press? And the partisan press is the historical model where every party, everyone with a point of view, had their own newspaper, basically. And if somebody wanted to judge what the truth was, they would read all these different things and put them together. So we're going to take a break right now. When we get back, we'll discuss that. Thank you. Welcome back to Calumet Perspectives. We were just talking about the recent turn, I think, in news media in the United States, at least, to something that's starting to look like a partisan press. Do you think that's the case, and what does that mean?
I think that the growth of all the internet communications channels are definitely a throwback. It's a return to the 1940s when towns like Chicago had 4 or 5 or 6 newspapers, each supporting a specific point of view, and each appealing to a segment of the community. So it does seem like inevitably we're headed in that direction. Fox News is another similar example of that.
Right.
Well, what I would, this is not so much on whether it's happening, but can I make a comment on the value of it?
Sure. Because I guess the issue is, does this sort of solve the problem that you were raising?
Well, see, here's the thing. My sense is, in a lot of media discussions, people have in mind two models. One is this model of this, I think, spurious notion of objectivity that some journalists have of, no point of view at all. Or it's this lawyerly sort of thing where you're for one side no matter what the evidence is. Right. And I'd like to suggest a third possibility, something more like a scientific conception of objectivity, where you're trying to determine the truth based on a reasoned examination of the relevant evidence. So I think if you have a number of partisan presses, that might be better than just one press that claims to be objective but really has a definite point of view. But it would be better still, I think, if these different presses, rather than being dedicated to one particular point of view, are seeking the truth through evidence and reasoned discourse.
Can I suggest, though, that this shift to partisanship, to some extent, is driven by the need to serve different markets in the community. And so if you look at the history of journalism, you'll see that in large enough markets there have been papers or radio stations or whatever that serve the conservative working class and that serve the conservative white collar and on and on and on. There's also inevitably a media outlet that serves those who seek additional knowledge. And so in Chicago, for example, the Chicago Daily News, a newspaper that no longer exists, had the reputation of serving that community. I think that it's more likely that you're going to see that kind of information delivered on a more consistent basis if we have a more fragmented media. Because as you've pointed out, we tend to have a homogeneous media that tends to turn everything into white bread.
My concern, though, is if we abandon this notion of objectivity.
Well, which notion of objectivity?
Well, the one. See, here's where I think it is. I think, I think that the Woodward definition is kind of the working definition right now for most journalists.
And what is that?
And that is that they're trying to get the best available version of the truth. They're trying to get as close to objectivity as they can get.
Well,
but they're not claiming it, right? Now the organization may be claiming it, and the journalism instructor may be demanding it, right? But I don't think that anyone would be foolish enough to make the statement that you quoted Ted Koppel as making today. What do you think? I mean, I think we're past that.
I think we're past that.
I think we're past that.
But I mean, I would say, if Bob Woodward thinks he's getting as close to the truth as he can, he's a fool. I mean, the methods he's using simply won't do it. If what you're doing is you're going and you're talking to these people in power and getting their perspective and not seeking any independent perspective, not getting any foreign perspective,
But consider what Jim's saying, right? I mean, that's Woodward's public, right? I mean, that's.
But then it's not the truth. It's not the closest approximation to the truth. You see?
It's his version of the truth.
Yeah.
And Woodward still has 3 or 4 fans.
Yeah.
And they will buy everything that he says. I think, though, that the working definition that Bob Woodward espouses is in fact not being practiced consistently enough, because it's not about what's the most readily available truth. It's about everybody's version of the truth. And I would argue that those are 2 different things.
But I guess what I'm just suggesting that we need to add on that is that it's everyone's attempt to discover the truth, as opposed to everyone just taking a position. It's sort of the difference between rhetoric and persuasion. Rhetoric, as defined by Aristotle, is an attempt to discover the truth by making the best argument you can make on one side of an issue. The other person makes the best argument they can make on the other side of the issue. A discerning audience weighs these 2 things and perhaps gets closer to the truth as a result, right? But Aristotle would say that you are violating the rules of the game if you're making an argument that you don't believe is true, right? Yeah. And so I think that as we move into a partisan press era, if that indeed is where we're going, right? I think it's beneficial for those journalists who are part of that new model to at least be trying to tell the best version of the story that they can tell, given the parameters of what they're working from, who they're interviewing,
that gives the game away, given who they're interviewing. I mean, because look, if you're trying to reach the truth, you would never behave the way Bob Woodward does. Would any scientist investigating any scientific question say, okay, the way I'm going to try to figure this out is go interview some people in power? No, they would look
social scientists would do that, definitely.
Well, okay, not in the physical sciences. I mean, they would.
Let's compare apples to apples here.
Well, look. A lot of these things, there are massive amounts of evidence that are readily available that don't come out of the mouths of the people these journalists interview, and that evidence is just systematically ignored. So that, for example,
wait, but systematically ignored. It's a big charge here, right? I mean,
easily documented.
Okay, well, you, in your book, you talked about El Salvador.
Yeah,
right?
That's one example.
And you talked about how the press was pretty much just covering one side of the story.
Right.
But Joan Didion published a book-length essay, 83, I think, right? Which certainly took a different side on that story, right? And so there was a contrary argument that was out there. It wasn't necessarily in the formal news media, but it was available, right? There
are lots of books available, that have different points of view.
Right.
That's certainly true.
Okay, so wasn't that a kind of a realization of what this partisan press era could look like? I mean, Joan Didion making a sincere effort to tell the story from her point of view. A reporter maybe who isn't smart enough to realize that there are other sources out there telling it from the official point of view, right? And then maybe somebody, I worked for an underground newspaper in the 60s, maybe somebody at an underground newspaper telling it from their point of view, but at least all of them making sincere efforts, as opposed to, and this is what I want to set up as the antithesis of this, as opposed to what you were suggesting, as opposed to someone on perhaps a news channel that is deliberately obfuscating the truth and deliberately trying to slant the news in a particular direction. And I guess some of us might be able to name examples of this.
Yeah.
But that to me is what I think that's problematic. I don't think it's problematic if somebody covering Washington D.C. for the New York Times goes to the standard sources and writes the standard story,
but
as long as somebody else can write another story somewhere else with their sources, putting it in a different way.
But no one does. So let me give just one example. Take Iraq in the 1980s.
Yes.
When Saddam Hussein was getting massive amounts of military support from the U.S., economic support from the U.S., diplomatic support from the U.S. Meanwhile, all the international human rights organizations were documenting his many crimes, his use of chemical weapons, his kidnapping of the children.
And you had access to this information.
Hold on,
right?
let me finish.
Yes.
Not from the U.S. mainstream press. Kidnapping the children of his political opponents and torturing them to get information from the mainstream press completely covered that up. Not through some kind of deliberate conspiracy, but hold on, but they didn't go to the sources.
But cover up means conspiracy. You can't say they're covering it up and it wasn't a conspiracy.
All right, I'll withdraw that word. They never covered it. How about that? They never covered it.
Okay.
So then once the U.S. turns against him, now all that stuff comes out. There were plenty of people trying to bring it out at the time. The press ignored it. There are thousands of examples like that. There wasn't anyone in the mainstream press who was exposing it. It was a complete uniformity.
But what you're talking about now, when you start discussing international affairs and our coverage of international events, the fact that we don't do it as effectively as some may is more a function of the very real situation that exists in the United States. We are an extremely parochial country.
Right.
We have a very parochial sense of what is newsworthy in journalism, and the result is that everything gets filtered through the prisms that we use, right? If it ain't an American source, it's probably not a good enough source because our readers don't care about it.
But where is the professionalism in that? Part of the idea of being a professional is you don't just bow to economic necessity. Dentists could make more money if they told all their patients to eat lots of sugar, but they have some professional responsibility. If journalists are supposed to inform people about what's important in the world, they shouldn't just be going by what will my readers accept. You need...
Okay, and if I could just bring up one other interesting point here in relation to this, okay? What we have is we have a press that we sometimes call the fourth estate, right? But it's really a metaphor. They're not part of government. The role of a reporter is not defined anywhere. There's no law that says a reporter has to cover something or has to cover it in a particular way, right? How do you how do you move us to the ideal that you're describing here without taking away freedom of the press?
Well, I'm not talking about some law forcing people to do it.
What do you do then? I mean, if I think that, if I'm putting out a paper and I think that my audience wants to hear this story from the point of view of the U.S. government, right? I should be able to cover that story from their point of view.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I'm not saying there should be a law against
it. And to me, the only professional violation there would be if I thought the U.S. government were lying to me and then I covered it anyway. I think that I should have a problem with that, but I don't think it's necessarily a problem if I trust the government and I report their story.
And it's okay with you if you never learn from history. You never learn that governments lie. You never learn to be skeptical on sources and check it out against the facts.
But I have other sources.
Actually, Tom, I think that the solution is to go back to this partisanship that you talked about a few minutes ago. Because in fact, if you wanted multiple, and partisan goes beyond political. It could be geopolitical. You could have a partisan press that slices a story 20 different ways, or analyzes a story 20 different ways, and that gives you absolute access to all those points of view.
Well, it was a good discussion, gentlemen. I just, I think that we're probably moving in that direction one way or the other. I just hope that as that balances out, from my point of view, that we have journalists who are attempting to tell the best version of the story that they can tell.
Absolutely.
And maybe they need to go a lot farther in that direction than they have been going. But I would think it would be a real step backwards if this just turned into a kind of a persuasive debate and people trying to get away with whatever lie they think.
Oh, well, we can agree on that, I
public,
think.
Right?
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Calumet Perspectives.
Experience for a lifetime.
At Purdue Calumet, you'll combine a Purdue education with rich, work-related experience that impresses employers.
Experience for a lifetime.
At Purdue Calumet, you'll take what you learn in the classroom and apply it to a real-world environment. At Purdue Calumet, you'll gain
experience for a lifetime.
Phone 1-800-HI-PURDUE, 1-800-HIPURDUE.